Welcome to Unit 4 on communicating and relating. So we're going to be talking about language and relationships. Main topics that we'll be covering: how to have a successful intercultural encounter and build relationships with people from different cultures. We're going to be talking specifically about different styles of communication, different verbal styles, talking about sources of problems in communication and how to solve them. One of the ways to do that is to gain knowledge about the other person. The more we know, the less we're going to assume, and the less likely it is that we're going to fall back on stereotypes. One of the things that we'll be talking about also is something that's discussed a lot in communication studies, this idea of anxiety and uncertainty that we have typically when we encounter someone for the first time, and how to overcome those issues. So we have typically a lot of different kinds of relationships, and those relationships will vary in terms of how important they are to us and how permanent those relationships are. Some of those are going to be positive, some of them probably not so much. One of the things that's interesting is how much relationships vary across cultures in terms of the different roles that one has within a family, within a work environment, within schools. And that can be quite different from culture to culture. The other thing that obviously changes is the nature of relationships over time. There are a scale of relationships from fairly distant to very close. So we're going to be talking quite a bit about encountering people for the first time as strangers, but talking about these other kinds of relationships as well. And so one of the things, going to start at kind of the distant relationship. One of the things that is often discussed in how we approach people for the first time that we haven't met before is that we tend to have apprehension because of lack of knowledge. We don't know much about the person. That creates anxiety, that can create conflict, communication problems. One of the things that varies quite a bit is where we meet that person, and there are lots of different kinds of environments that are possible, and that's going to affect the encounter. So if we meet someone for the first time on a busy street in a large urban environment, that's quite different from meeting someone at a bar or meeting someone on the street in a small town. One of the things that's interesting when we meet someone for the first time is what do we talk about? What are the topics that are appropriate? Some of the ones that one is often advised to avoid are things like politics, religion, asking people how much they earn. But this can vary from culture to culture. So in some cultures, it would be fine, for example, to ask a man about his wife, but in some Middle Eastern countries, that would be inappropriate. In terms of safe topics across cultures, there are a couple of things that are often pointed to as things that tend to be harmless culturally. Food is one of those that connects all of us and that people like to talk about. Music is another. One of the ways that we sometimes can break the ice is through humor, and here's an example of an attempt to do that.
So the Dalai Lama walks into a pizza shop.
Cosa shop?
Pizza?
Pizza shop, yes.
Yeah, pizza shop. And says, "Can you make me one with everything?"
What's that? That's what it. Oh, yes.
Do you know what I mean? Can you make me one with everything?
Theoretically possible.
Oh, I knew that wouldn't work.
we know that humor is great, but it doesn't always work across cultures. So this was an Australian journalist trying to break the ice with the Dalai Lama at the beginning of a television interview. Excuse me. But it was problematic culturally in that it's not clear that the Dalai Lama eats pizza or knows a lot about pizza. But there was an attempt to connect a pizza with everything on it to the Dalai Lama's Buddhist view of religious view of life. But that can be a good icebreaker. Well, let's talk about differences in attitudes towards strangers across cultures. And this sometimes is pointed to as something that's different in different kinds of cultures. We always want to be careful about labeling cultures as collectivistic or individualistic, but certainly there are broad scope differences, broad brush differences in terms of how strangers are, how encounters with strangers tend to go. In collectivistic cultures, you have the tendency for very strong in-group identities, that people identify very much with the groups that they belong to. Those relationships tend to be somewhat longer lasting than in other kinds of cultures. And if you take the example of a country like Japan, it has a reputation of people being very polite, very nice to one another on a one-on-one basis. But then you have a situation where you have people in crowds, for example, on the subway in Tokyo. And there you have very different treatment of individuals, because they're not really members of a group. They're kind of non-persons. And so people, they have actually subway pushers that push people into the subway cars because there's just so many people trying to get on the subway. So very different treatment of people. That's a good example of how the context will determine relationships and how people relate to one another. In individualistic cultures, we tend to vary considerably in terms of how strangers are dealt with or treated on an initial encounter. We tend to, for example, in the U.S., and this is an example of an individualistic culture, we tend to have less in-group coherence than in other cultures that are labeled collectivistic. In general, Americans tend to be very curious and accepting of strangers. That's kind of a stereotype, but I think that is generally true, although it varies. There's something that varies regionally and that will vary according to where one lives in urban environments where there are lots of folks already and lots of strangers. There'll be less curiosity than in small towns, for example. What's a friend? Well, that can vary significantly. The term is sometimes difficult to translate into different languages because it has different meanings, different scales from somebody who is just an acquaintance to a romantic partner. And one of the things that's interesting there is that in Asian cultures, for example, relationships and friendships in particular tend to be universal, that one does things with friends in all kinds of activities together. In the United States, we tend to compartmentalize activities with friends. So we might do one activity with one friend and something else with someone else. So we might go bowling with this friend and go out to a club or a cafe with someone else. So there's more variation, I think, in terms of the nature of friendships. And it's also the case that Americans tend to make friends fairly easily but that those friendships are not necessarily as long-lasting as in other cultures. There's also a big difference in cultures in terms of romantic partners, in terms of how you find a partner. This is something that we're going to be talking about later in a subsequent unit. But certainly in some cultures, the practice of finding a mate is very different than how that works in the United States, for example, in the role that families play. That particular dynamic also varies quite a bit across cultures. In some countries, it's normal to have extended families living together with not just the parents and the children, but the grandparents, maybe even the aunts and uncles as well. To what extent the family has impact on important life decisions varies quite a bit. In some cultures, the parents are going to have a determining voice in what a person studies at a university, what career is chosen. That can vary significantly. One of the things that is important in dealing with, in communicating with other people from different cultures or even within the same culture is a recognition that there are different styles of verbal communication. And when we meet someone for the first time, we obviously don't know much about that person in terms of either the verbal style, the cultural background. We tend to, if we don't know much, we tend to make assumptions, and we tend to put people into categories rather than treat them as individuals. And in social science research, there's been a lot of work dealing with this particular topic in terms of how we approach people for the first time, the assumptions that we make, and for analyzing the differences that exist in terms of verbal styles, both within languages and across languages. One of those that's very frequently discussed is the so-called Bernstein Hypothesis. This goes back to Basil Bernstein's work, in which he talks about two sets of verbal codes that he saw as fundamental differences in how humans communicate, the so-called elaborated style or code and the restricted code. And the difference here is basically on how important verbal language is. So in elaborated code, which is typically associated with individualistic cultures, there you make rich use of language, and the person overhearing a conversation will have full information that's conveyed. A restricted code refers to more condensed, shorter use of verbal language, and the richer significance of nonverbal factors that might include gestures, body language, but also might refer to knowledge about a person's family background, knowledge about that person's work position, where that person is in the social hierarchy of that culture, whether the person has a position of power. Those are things that obviously can affect conversations, and typically in such situations there's a more restricted language style that's used, so that there will be, for example, in some cultures, honorifics, titles that are going to be important to use, and that's an important part of that verbal code, that you should use those. So you're restricted in how to address someone, make sure that you use the right politeness formulas, for example. There's also a distinction often made between cultures where people tend to be very direct in their expression of their ideas and opinions, this kind of direct style versus indirect style. And here again, direct style is often associated with cultures that are identified as individualistic, the United States or Western Europe, for example, and indirect style where one doesn't necessarily express overtly one's opinion, where it's more likely that one will hold back or not say directly what one thinks. One might not give a direct yes-no answer to a yes-no question. This kind of indirect mode of communication is often associated with Asian cultures and with collectivistic cultures in general. The speech code theory was initially called the ethnography of communication by the researcher who developed it, who was Gary Philipson. And he did a landmark study of a neighborhood in Chicago, which was really interesting. And this was followed by a number of other ethnographic studies that zeroed in on particular populations within countries. And so he studied this group of men as kind of a unique speech community, and discovered that there were first of all, very significant differences in how the men interacted linguistically with how women interacted, but also with how men in other subgroups within the United States used language. And so he looked specifically at how you talk like a man in such a community. And it was very interesting, the terms of the use of language, the use of silence, the use of nonverbal communication. Another researcher that has been important in this field is Howard Giles, who came up with this communication accommodation theory, which talks about how we tend to react to people whom we don't know, whom we meet for the first time, and how we adjust our language or don't adjust our language according to the context, according to the person with whom we're speaking. And there are two basic processes that he identified: convergence, in which case we try to match our verbal and nonverbal communication patterns to those of the person that we're speaking with, and divergence, where we maintain our own kind of speech habits, and where there's a differentiation that is maintained, and that's most common in conversations where people are of different social status of power or power positions. He also identified this phenomenon of over-accommodation, where we exaggerate the convergence, where we tend to overdo our efforts to accommodate the different speech of the person we're talking with. And I'll show you just a brief clip here to illustrate that.
Please tell me you speak English. I'm Detective Carter. Do you speak any English? Do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth? I cannot believe this shit. First I get a bullshit assignment, now Mr. Rice-A-Roni don't even speak American. Come on, man, my ride over here. Put your bag in the back. Put your bag in the back. No. You put your own shit in the back. I'm not a sky cap. I'm FBI, you understand? The hell you think this is?
So this is an example of what can be labeled ethnocentrism in practice, talking loudly and enunciating the words very clearly, not listening very well to the person, not getting clues from the person in terms of does the other person understand or not, using divisive or insulting nicknames, Mr. Riceroni, in this case, using slang, things that really don't accommodate the other person, that don't help the conversation to be effective. One of the other things that's often discussed in communication studies is how to reduce uncertainty and anxiety. And there are a number of kind of common sense things that we can do that can happen during a conversation, but also before the conversation takes place. And one of those is to kind of size up the person and anticipate what some of the things that we might need to do in the conversation are to accommodate the other person. For example, if we're fairly sure that it's a non-native speaker of our language, we will need to, from the beginning, kind of adjust our tone and our use of vocabulary, or reduce our use of slang, those kinds of things, to make sure that the other person understands. We have to be aware of nonverbal code that the person might use to indicate lack of understanding, lack of comprehension. Excuse me. And then there are other things that we can do after the fact as well, to kind of analyze the conversation and think about what may have led to miscommunication. There's also what's called the anxiety uncertainty management theory, which talks about in primarily this idea of mindfulness as a way to think about how to improve miscommunication. And what's meant by mindfulness is basically thinking about, being conscious about our verbal behavior and adjusting our language appropriately, thinking about people that we're talking with as individuals and not as stereotypical members of a group. And one of the things in this theory is that the communication effectiveness is defined as when a message is interpreted in the way that it's meant. That's something that doesn't always happen because of different filters that can take place. If we're very ethnocentric, for example, we're just not going to hear the message as it's probably intended to be heard. The last major topic that's covered in this unit is gender and communication, and this is something that there's been a lot of work done on in recent years, and there's a lot of interesting work being done currently on this, and there are different perspectives on whether, in fact, there are major differences between communication styles of men and women. Deborah Tannen, for example, from Georgetown University, assumes that there are, that women talk in order to build relationships, and that men basically talk in order to transmit information, but also to build themselves up in terms of group identity and relationships. One of the theories that is fairly widespread today is what's called standpoint theory, which assumes that women as a marginalized group have a very different perspective and have less power to assert themselves because of male dominance. This is something that's similar to the muted group theory that we talked about in a previous unit.